audience will be kept off. Also, please feel free to type in your questions and your comments either in the Q&A box or in the chat box at the center bottom of your screen. Could you please add to the text which of the panelists you're addressing? That makes the task a lot easier. And also please specify if you want to speak or if you want me to read it out, we will act accordingly. So intellectual history and political thought in recent times has taken a global turn in an attempt to move beyond the nation and the modern in historical analysis. The most significant intellectual contribution of these works have been to question the globality of intellectual history traditions and in turn urge scholars to introduce spaces beyond the Anglophone world within the realm of intellectual history as fertile grounds of ideation. This panel seeks to explore whether the intellectual histories of the actors from the margins of history can make the global and inclusive category while addressing questions of agency, mobility, and positionality. To chair this panel, we have with us Dr. Simon Yarrow. Dr. Yarrow is a senior lecturer in medieval history at the University of Birmingham. He has published on the cult of saints in the Middle Ages and on 12th century Anglo-Norman historiography, with particular regard to gender and elite political culture. He has published on economic imaginaries of the global Middle Ages and is currently thinking about the pre-modern intersections of sacred and commercial materiality. The discussant for this panel is Dr. Egas Moniz Bandeira. He is based in Germany right now. Egas is a researcher at the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory in Frankfurt, and he's also a member of Comparative Research Project on the emergence of modern legal practices in Japan, China, and the Ottoman Empire. After studying law and East Asian studies at Heidelberg University, he completed his PhD program also at Heidelberg and Tohoku University with a dissertation on the late King constitutional history. His main research interest is global intellectual history, with a focus on its refractions in modern East Asia. He is the co-editor of the volume Planting Parliaments in Eurasia, 1850 to 1950, Concepts, Practices, and Mythologies, which is about to come out with Routledge. And his work has also been published in the Journal of Transcultural Studies, Global Intellectual History, and Journal of Eurasian Studies, amongst others. I will now let Dr. Yarrow take on from here, and we will have the presentations first, and then comments from Egas, and then open it up to the audience. Thank you. All yours, Dr. Yarrow.
Thanks so much, Shivatri. I just want to add to the praise and admiration that's accumulating for you and the efforts that you and your team and those who've supported you have put into making this such a great success intellectually and practically. I'm sure that there's a unanimity on that amongst the audience. I've got 3 speakers as this part of this session, and the first session is by Wen Yu. Wen Yu is a postdoctoral fellow at the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Michigan. She graduated with a PhD from the University of Harvard in 2018 and is currently working up the dissertation which won a prize at Harvard University into book manuscript form, which is called The Search for a Chinese Way in the Modern World, from the Rise of Evidential Learning to the Birth of Chinese Cultural Identity. But today Wen's going to talk to us about historical consciousness and global political modernity, Zhang Taiyan's redefinition of Confucianism for a Chinese canon of self-government, 1891 to 1904. Please.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you very much, Professor Yarrow, for the nice introduction. And let me share my screen. And hello, everyone. Welcome to the presentation. I'm very glad to share my work here with a truly global group of excellent scholars at this conference. So in my paper I submitted to the conference, I focus on a leading intellectual and a scholar in modern Chinese history, whose name is Zhang Taiyan. And he's a very, very well-known and leading intellectual and scholars in 20th century. And he has many identities and many aspects of his scholarly and political life that has left a very important impact on modern Chinese history. And particularly, I want to focus on his work, which is a classic work that he produced from late 19th century to early 20th century. It's called Tofu, and it translated as a book written in oppression. So it is a revolutionary manifesto and to declare the China's nationalist revolution from the Qing Manchu rule and to construct a Chinese republican. So since I don't have much time for this presentation to reconstruct the details and narratives of the paper, so what I will do is to focus on a broader picture and some larger claims I want to achieve. So this paper is a part of my ongoing book project, The Search for Chinese Way in the Modern World, from the rise of evidential learning to the birth of the making of a Chinese cultural identity from 16,000 to 2020. So it is a laundry study on how the search for a Chinese cultural identity had become central to the political and the moral debate over values in modern China until today. But different from the dominant framework in a field that sees national thought in China as a product of Western style modernization, a fundamental break from China's past, the question that really drives my work is that why is it important to construct a cultural and national identity at the first place? And if cultural identity and nationalism was an answer, then what was the question for the intellectuals at the transitional moment of Chinese history? So Zhang is a crucial figure in this transitional moment, and he's one of the important figures that I cover in the book. And in today's talk, I particularly want to make a few points about his book, Tofu, and as a declaration and argument for Chinese self-rule. So there's several aspects of it very interesting. So first, its argument of self-rule is not really based on the social contract theory and particularly on the natural rights theory, but on the restoration of a cultural and historical identity of the Chinese people. And thus, the book also is not a philosophical argument or appealing to self-evident common sense or a legal argument based on historical fact. But an eroded scholarship in Chinese about Chinese civilization, and especially a reflective commentary of its own elite learning tradition and its contemporary failure. So because for him, it is the responsibility of the elite learning tradition to devote itself to the protection of the identity and the interest of the community, then revolution is the imperative for restoring the intellectual and the moral integrity of the learning tradition. So to understand what Zhang Taiyan wants to achieve and the ideological roots of his position, I go back to the reform movement in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the beginning of the intellectual demand for constitutional reform in late Qing. So we all know that starting from the late 19th century, increasing interest in Western modern constitutionalism and particularly representative model of government became a superior model of government for the reform-minded Chinese intellectuals and literati scholars. But it is important to note that many reform-minded literati scholars actually saw it as a realization of certain kind of ideal Confucian meritocratic rule. So, and then for them, and then in order to achieve this kind of superior model of government, and there is a, it would support the broader participation of educated elite to join in government legislation. And for them, this question and this movement become as an ideological question, it proposed a question about how to reinterpret the Confucian textual traditions as a kind of base for pushing the constitutional change that's needed for China, and how, in what way can the Confucian textual tradition claim authority as a post-imperial constructional doctrine for China, constitutional doctrine for China. So I want to bring up two kind of legacies from Confucian political thought right up to that point that became available for literati scholars at that moment to embrace the constitutional movement, the idea of a new particular kind of new modern government. The first tradition, which I want to call Confucian Universalism, is a tradition that's represented by what we know a New Text classical as Taoism and the New Confucian moral philosophy. And another tradition, so what I want to call Confucian particularism and historicism, it's represented by 17th century evidential learning. So to have an overview of their differences, for the Confucian Universalism, it focuses on a kind of value, a philosophy of value that based on moral universalism. So for them, Confucian sages are moral and spiritual leaders to unify the world. And the concept of China or 中国 really represents some kind of fundamental moral teaching as exemplar. But for the evidential learning tradition, and which we can call is the kind of historical constructivism, and for them, the Confucian sages are really understood as a political leader committed to the interest of the historical community. And China or 中国 actually represent a successful self-governing historical community. And so for the Confucian Universalism, the classics are considered as a predetermined universalist teaching, while for the evidential learning tradition, the classics was understood as a cumulative historical product of the Chinese cultural community. So at the moment of late Qing reform, I want to bring out two figures, and one is the Kang Youwei, who would be the representative of this Confucian Universalism as a way to embrace constitutional change, while Zhang Taiyan, our main intellectual that we're going to focus on will be the representative of this particularism or historicism. And so briefly introduce Kang Youwei's tradition. It's important because it lays a foundation or create a background where the Zhang Taiyan's position will be constructed to respond to. And particularly, Kang Youwei became the leader of the so-called New Learning movement, and later become the leader of the political reform and the 100 days of reform. So for him, he redefined Confucianism as a kind of progressive tradition, as the foundation of the New Learning movement, and as building a Chinese constitutional monarchy. And particularly, he sees that Confucianism represents universalistic, transcendental principles of human development and toward a unification of humanity. And fundamental to this interpretation is the idea of equality and humanitarianism as something that transcends both Chinese tradition and the Western democratic tradition. And based on this idea, he started to construct the new type of Confucian commentary for a constitutional monarchy. And what he did first was to redefine the nature of the Confucian textual tradition. And for him, this collective body of texts was actually Confucius' own creation and for the purpose of laying laws. And using the esoteric Gongyang commentary tradition, he saw that Confucian was actually represent a lawgiver whose justification was given by the heaven and earth and function as a kind of prophet who can oversee the future of the human world. And because of this, he was justified as the real sovereign of China. And essentially for him, learning is the process of abstracting universal principles because of this understanding of Confucianism as transcending both history and cultural boundaries. And cumulative cultural traditions or symbolic traditions became less important in terms of the foundation of building new norms. Well, in this context, let's look at Zhang Taiyan and look at how he rose as another path to China's political change at that moment, representing the traditional evidential learning. So I want to talk about quickly like two legacies that Zhang Taiyan brought to life in the at this moment to respond to the New Learning movement. So first legacy is a 17th century legacy of this evidential learning tradition. In 17th century, it was born as a kind of critical political thought against the Qing moralist and universalist state ideology and paternalism. And particularly, it understood that government or state as a product of the historical development of this cultural tradition of the Chinese community. So it's a kind of classical culturalist idea of self-rule. And another legacy is the 18th century tradition of evidential learning, which is that this critical political thought was transformed into a cumulative collective historical scholarship of ancient Chinese culture. And at the same time, we see the rise of argument that trying to use critical method of philology to unmasking the kind of hypocrisy and injustice, abuse of power behind the imperial ideology. So from here, I want to go into the argument of the Qiushu, and I won't be able to go through the details that I reconstructed in the paper. So here I want to talk about the key argument and the way that Zhang Taiyan made his argument in this 1904 version of Qiushu. So first, this book is a critique of the new learning cultural problem of a self-denial of China's own cumulative history. So, and particularly for Zhang Taiyan, that this kind of self-denial of China's real development in antiquity, which is represented by the peak of its three dynasties, especially represented by its ritual, law, and the knowledge and the linguistic legacy, that leads to a kind of naive, a kind of romantic kind of humanitarianism, and which would potentially lead China to become vulnerable to, especially to the Western imperialism, who wants to, in a way, at the moment, to transmit and in a way to introduce universalistic ideas of humanitarianism underlying the democracy into China. And second, he sees that he emphasized that it is the ethical cultural identity that provides the most inalienable foundation of values. It is not humanitarianism, it is not universalism. And third, he argues that it is the cumulative, continuous symbolic system that served as a key of the development of civilization. And especially that he emphasized that China was facing three modern troubles. First is the decline of China's own elite learning since the rise of empty-minded speculative learning represented by New Confucianism. And second is the Manchu rulers' censorship of Chinese communities' own cultural and historical writing. And third, it is at the moment of China's cultural decline, now you have the coming in of the large amount of powerful Western knowledge and the larger symbolic system and the cultural hegemony that it may cause. And so, apart from that, he started to link in this book, he make a clear argument that it is the historical consciousness and historical learning that would lead to the reconstruction, a rebirth of moral integrity of China's cultural tradition. And for instance, he emphasized that it becomes a moral standing, a moral point that he's making, that it is, it shows that in order to build the new norms and new political changes, these new norms and political changes need to build on, has to respect the existing shared norms and the cumulative historical institutions and culture. And second, he sees that instead of defining Confucianism as a philosopher, as someone who has the ability to foresee the future of humanity, and Confucianism instead is simply a historian, and classics is just a mark of China's cultural identity. And at the same time, he argued that it is evidential learning, particularly the 18th century's philologists, who should serve as the true model for the new citizens for a post-imperial Chinese order. And last, he critiqued the moral universalism in many ways as a cover-up for imperialism and cultural hegemony that would eventually damage the need for China to reborn as a modern culture and the political system. And eventually he defined the national history as a project of cultural transformation for China. So for him, the national history is a collective, it centers on the collective and continuous symbolic tradition. And for him, China is a spontaneous growth of the community's cultural institutions and the customs in the everyday practice. And essentially, he argued that because we need to know the interest and the need of the community from its historical development to understand it from a bottom-up approach, and then cultural interest of community can only be known from within, and history is the only methodological appropriate approach to get to the ideas of what the community need and what is the foundations of its value. So just to make a few final remarks, and in the dominant scholarship, the collapse of the imperial system and its doctrines of universal kingship has been often seen as have deprived the Confucian learning traditions of its only foundation. So Confucianism in some ways understood as something that entirely tied to this doctrine of universal kingship. So the fall of the imperial system would take away the foundation that makes Confucianism valid and meaningful. So, but what I wanted to show in the paper, particularly in this very brief presentation of the paper, is that when we restore the questions or the context where the argument of self-rule and the cultural identity became important, we actually see a very important debate of the Confucian tradition that is about the source of shared values and the role of elite culture. And from here, I want to make a final remark, which is when we think about the global political modernity that often considered as drawing upon the political system of constitutionalism, nation state, and we often try to see it as in some way carrying over a Western model of ideas about the foundation of government, and also about the ideas of the origins of nationalism as a product of industrial capitalism. But however, when we look into non-Western cultures, oftentimes what we see is that the local textual traditions, and especially the historical debates over normativity within the local traditions, often play a very fundamental and important role in shaping the authorities and norms that made the change possible. And often they also serve as the medium for the local intellectuals to really make sense and understand the modern canon from the Europe. So my final point would be, I think scholars in intellectual history have argued for the importance of provincializing the European canonical tradition as a part of the cultural tradition of larger European cultural, legal, political life. And at the same time, I think having a comparative perspective of non-Western cultures' local textual traditions, and especially how their debate over normativity shape their understanding of modernity, will be just as important as provincializing European tradition for constructing a more decanonized and globalized historical narrative. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Wen. That was wonderfully brought together. It's a great start to the panel. Moving to our second speaker, Banu Turnaoğlu is an affiliated lecturer in the Department of Politics and International Studies. She held a postdoctoral position as an early career Leverhulme Fellow at Polis, from which she received her PhD. Before Cambridge, she obtained an MSc in Political Theory from the University of Oxford and a BA in International Relations and History, double major from Kos University, Istanbul. Her research lies at the intersection of political theory, global intellectual history, international relations, and Ottoman political thought. She is the author of The Formation of Turkish Republicanism, which was shortlisted for the Royal Historical Society Gladstone Prize. Her writing has appeared in leading journals such as History of Political Thought, Modern Intellectual History and Middle Eastern Studies, as well as in edited volumes from Oxford University Press and IB Tauris. She's working on a new book manuscript provisionally entitled The Eastern Question, A New History, which is under contract with Princeton University Press. Banu, please take it away.
And thanks, Chanthu, for organizing such a wonderful conference. And I'm really happy to be a part of the discussion. So I also have, I'm going to share my screen. Can you see it? Okay. One second. Okay. So yeah, the title of my talk today is Positivism and Anti-Imperialism in Ahmed Rizal.
Could you put it on full screen so that we can see the thing?
Okay. Okay, if I can manage. Oh.
Perfect.
Just 1 second, I messed it up. I tried to see my other screen and I don't know how to do that. Just one second. Is it okay that I do that, because I kind of couldn't figure out how to do it.
It's fine. It's fine. Go ahead. It's fine.
Okay, so this paper seeks to situate the dramatic emergence of the Ottoman positivist anti-imperialism during 1880s and 1890s in a wider international context, and further developing the globalization of intellectual history. So there has been a recent turn to empire, to use Jennifer Pitt's phrase, in political theory and history of political thought. However, the global dimension of 19th century imperialism has relatively been neglected. So much scholarly work has focused on empire's place in the imagination of European economical thinkers, or on its connections with liberalism, while overlooking the effects of Western imperialist and colonialist policies on the victims, on the colonizers, on the colonized. So by examining the anti-imperialist voice of the leading Ottoman political thinker Ahmed Rizal, who led the Ottoman Positivists and the Parisian branch of the Young Turks, so this paper will contribute to the expanding of the scope of the studies of imperialism in particular, and help us to rethink the canon in general. Ahmed Rizal's work did not merely aim to find a footing for Islam within positivism, nor was it a vain attempt to produce a theory, as some commentators suggest. Instead, Ahmed Rizal produced a powerful and systematic political theory, carefully systemizing positivism, anti-imperialism, republicanism, and constitutional liberalism, something that some contemporary intellectual historians still have failed to appreciate. So this paper does not treat debates about positivism, republicanism, or liberalism as mere derivatives of Western ideas. Rather, it aims to show how Ahmed Rizal, as Auguste Comte's disciple, updated, reinterpreted, and refashioned positivist doctrine to fit the national and international needs, and to respond powerfully to domestic and external challenges that the Ottoman Empire faced. So, okay, who is Ahmed Rizal? So Ahmed Rizal was an Ottoman journalist, writer, prolific writer, indeed, a prominent figure in both French and Ottoman public life. So he had a major political and intellectual role as a leader of the Parisian branch of the Young Turks, as a public administrator, and later the president of the Chamber of Deputies and the Ottoman Senate. So he was writing on, reflecting on, and seeking to justify a certain form of domestic and international politics, not from an ivory tower. He was not detached from daily politics and practices, but rather deeply involved in politics and indeed tried to change it. So he disseminated his ideas through books, pamphlets, conferences, and the official actor propaganda organs, Meşveret in Turkish, and Meşveret Supplément Français in French. So as a member of Société Positiviste, he regularly wrote for French positivist journal, La Revue Occidentale and La Revue Internationale Positiviste, shaping both French and Ottoman public opinion. He also contributed to the British Positivist Journal, the Positivist Review, thereby also influencing British public opinion. Ahmed Rizal's impact extended beyond European geographical boundaries, reaching Latin America. So indeed, Meşveret was largely read by Latin American positivists. And therefore, I would argue that Ahmed Rizal deserves to be called an international political thinker, influential on a global scale. Ahmed Rizal's leadership defines the ideological outlook of the Parisian Young Turks. So they were Kantian positivists, anti-imperialists, equipped with a liberal, republican, and secular language. So I will now briefly discuss these elements individually and demonstrate how each component is closely interlinked with one another. I'll start with positivism. So Ahmed Rizal believed that a transformation to a liberal constitutional regime could not be achieved merely through political means like opening the parliament and drafting a constitution. Rather, it had to be realized primarily by a radical transformation in collective thought, attitudes, values, and morality under the guidance of positivist philosophy. So three key positivist concepts are significant in his analysis, and these are union, order, and progress. The union is associated with connecting or making a whole. Ahmed Rizal used this term as a weapon against national separatism and ethnic religious groups within the empire. So he was completely against nationalism. And some commentators believe that he was a Turkish nationalist, and this is not true. Linked to union was the concept of order, so it's nizam in Turkish, and it implies both domestic and international stability. For Ahmed Rizal, as for Kant, order requires the suppression of selfish, individualistic interests of individuals and groups in a society, and acting for the common good. In this sense, order is the foundation of ethics. And the other concept, that's progress, means improvement, moving towards a better future, and it can only come out of order, like in Kantian sense. So in explaining progress and secularization of intellectual development, Ahmed Rizal deploys the Kantian evolutionary theory of humanity, and that's the law of three stages. And these stages are theological, metaphysical, and scientific. In the final scientific stage, human mind passes into an age of positive thought, freed from religious dogma, fanaticism, and metaphysical knowledge, and rather defined by scientific knowledge, which provide the only genuine truth. So Ahmed Rizal that's the law of three stages is applying to all civilizations. So the term civilization is important here. So he defined it as, quote, collective of truths based on the acquisition made by human intelligence in all the various domains of knowledge, truths that have been accumulated and transmitted from generation to generation, end of quote. However, different civilizations evolve at different rates throughout history. So to aid the universal spirit of progress, Ahmed Rizal stressed that all nations must collaborate and help one another to remove the barriers such as despotism, militarism, and warfare. He believed that the progress of humanity towards the projected ends could be reached in a universal order where East and West, and in his term, Orient and Occident, would unite. Now I'll move on to the second element, that's anti-imperialism. His anti-imperialism stems from his positivist universalism. He condemned imperialism's effects on European character, arguing that the West had been shedding respect and honor under its insidious and fatal influence. Western imperialist policy, he claims, is nothing but injustice and causing, quote, bloodshed and intrigue in the eyes of the audience. He urged Europe to abandon imperialist policies, mainly for several reasons, and I have listed them as the following. Because imperialism involved injustice, destruction, exploitation, and oppression of the Oriental peoples. Because European aggression provoked similar reactions elsewhere, increasing animosity and rivalries throughout the world. Because the international disorder and anxiety it bred were unfavorable to the healthy revelation of humanity, and relatedly, because it disrupted the maintenance of peace and divided humanity. The imperialist policies, he believed, must be replaced by positivist policies or positivist politics. So what does he mean by positivist politics? And to him, this kind of politics must be based on moral principles of respect of all nations' equal moral worth and dignity, non-interventionism and non-interference. I will now briefly discuss these principles. Respect for people and nation is the first cardinal principle of positivist morality. Every nation for Ahmed Rizal was autonomous and must primarily protect its own national interests against external pressure and domination. However, this principle he felt was violated and ignored by imperialist powers. Ahmed Rizal denied the moral justification of imperialism under the pretext of la mission civilisatrice, which was the most influential legitimizing ideology of Western colonialism and imperialism in the 19th century. And it became a doctrine of French Republican expansionism, especially in the 1870s. Within its frontiers, Ahmed Rizal argued, the French Republic nurtured and enforced a constant belief in the sweet power of universal suffrage and the supremacy of arts, sciences, culture, and philosophy, while beyond its frontiers, it propagated colonial ambition under the pretext of civility and universality. And this mission civilisatrice Ahmed Rizal, for Ahmed Rizal, contradicted France's esprit laïque and the image of a modern, secular, industrialized, scientific nation. And central to the civilizing mission was also the Christian missionary activity. Its goal was to transform indigenous communities to imperial archetypes of civility and modernity by remodeling the individual and community and the state through Western Christian philosophies or principles. Ahmed Rizal fervently argued that the missionary activity only showed the seeds of discord and hatred amongst the people and of racial hostility in the audience, and he wrote, quote, "These missionaries are more concerned with exerting political influence than with spreading Christian instruction and faith," end of quote. Missionary activities believed only heightened hostility among Ottoman nationalities and ethnic groups, as manifested in the Armenian agitations, the Armenian question. The major cause of all divisions, hatred, and disorder within Ottoman society, Ahmed Rizal believed, was Sultan Ahmed Abdülhamid II, whose misrule, tyranny, and despotic deeds only weakened social ties, pitting different Muslim and Christian groups against one another, and thus inviting foreign intervention directed at protecting these oppressed groups, the people. The only solution to this domestic discord to him was to depose the Sultan and restrain the power of rulers through constitutional means by reviving the suspended 1876 constitution, reopening the parliament, and prompting a rigorous general reform movement in education and administration. A further principle of positivist morality was non-intervention and non-interference in the internal affairs of the states. So the moral behind non-interventionism was that each nation should have a right to govern their own affairs. This is an idea with a strong Republican emphasis. The idea is that if domestic unrest occurs, then it must primarily be resolved within national boundaries. Ahmed Rizal was a firm believer that a state should decide its own destiny, and that foreign intervention into domestic affairs would severely infringe on the independence and sovereignty of a nation. So he particularly protested against British interference in Turkey during the Balkan crisis, and condemned the self-righteousness, arrogance, and hypocrisy of British foreign policy, especially Gladstone's policy in the East. British interference, or foreign interference in general, had produced damaging consequences for peace and good governance. So despite sketching a gloomy picture of imperial regimes in disturbing peace, unity between the Orient and the Occident, Ahmed Rizal optimistically believed in the possibility of achieving peaceful relations. So his international plan was underpinned by the belief in eliminating political despotism at home, these are his words, and replacing with a constitutional regime and ending the financial despotism of Western powers. He projected a spiritual union of humanity through the application of secular, scientific, positivist principles to all nations, binding them together to live in peace and harmony. So to create this international unity, all religions must be secularized or positivized, so that a scientific linkage between the nations would be formed and the religion of humanity established. So I'll now move on to the last aspect of this vision, and that's republicanism. And once this positivist philosophy triumphed and despotic regimes toppled, Ahmed Rizal believed the question of imperialism would be ultimately resolved. So whereas Comte imagined a peaceful world order that rested in a federation of small positive republics, Ahmed Rizal did not provide a detailed picture of what kind of an international order he imagined. It's clear, though, that this international system would be composed of positive constitutional and moderate regimes that are based on order, progress, and morality. So his republicanism was then associated with the creation of constitutional regime, the rule of law as opposed to the arbitrary law, and the idea of liberty as self-rule and non-interference. Ahmed Rizal then understood liberty in its classical republican sense, and it means living freely in a free state. So his notion of republican liberty that has two components, or two dimensions, that are political and civil, or civic. A free state is then a political entity in which citizens are not subjected to the arbitrary will of the rulers, i.e. the sultans and bureaucrats, or to an imperial power. So in other words, liberty denotes both freedom from interference, and sometimes uses the term freedom from slavery, and freedom from arbitrary power of despots, together with the right of citizens to govern their own affairs through political participation, especially in the making of the law. So for Ahmed Rizal, then a republican government would in theory be suitable for the Ottoman state, because the first Islamic polity during the time of the four caliphs was at its inception a kind of a republic that recognizes in principle the ruler as someone elected by a decision of the assembly. So Ahmed Rizal then referenced a customary Islamic practice, meshweret, that's also the name of the journal, and it means deliberative assembly or deliberation, in describing the balance of governmental power. In the system, executive branch is checked and controlled by the legislative. And the source of power is the people, not the sultan. And in a striking sentence, it says, today, the king is the people, and the people are accountable to humanity, end quote. So it's worth noting that Ahmed Rizal's republicanism has had strong elitist undertones. He believed that the progressive development of Ottoman society could occur only through a strong centralized government represented by an elite with transformative power. Centralization is therefore essential to maintain diversity of religion, ethnicity, and nationality in a tolerant society. So this brings me to the end of my presentation. So the entire Republican, positivist, and anti-imperialist plan was soon challenged by the activist branch of the Young Turks and ethnic nationalists. An intense struggle over the ideas prepared the ground for the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, which was the forerunner of the Republican Revolution of 1923. So positivism was challenged again by a combination of nationalism, elitism, and militarism during the Balkan Wars and the First World War, and this ideology pushed positivism along with Ahmed Rizal to the intellectual margins. Although Ahmed Rizal's vision was once successful but then failed, so it doesn't mean that this theory was inherently or internally incoherent. Instead, his ideas of republicanism, laicity, anti-imperialism laid the primary intellectual foundations of the young Turkish Republic, and remained an enduring legacy of Turkish political thought. Moreover, Ahmed Rizal's political thought was a pioneering example of an early formation of a modern pluralist worldview, critiquing Western imperialism from an adjacent geographical and cultural setting. So by examining Ahmed Rizal as an exemplary case of a cross-cultural and hybrid Ottoman intellectual, I suggest that the history of political thought can expand its scope, transcending the conventional geographical boundaries between European, extra-European or Western and Eastern political thought, and appreciating the broader entanglement of these ideas and ideologies. So I will conclude by saying that to produce a more genuine canon on imperialism and have a more thorough grasp of the theoretical developments of the 19th century and early 20th centuries, and of course to decolonize the archives, more serious attention to such voices from beyond the Anglophone world should be given. And that's all I'm going to say, and thank you very much for listening and your attention.
Thank you so much, Banu. And now to our third speaker in this panel, Chanthu S. Chanthu is a research scholar at the Department of History, University of Hyderabad. His research charts the cultural fashioning of the self in the public sphere and the moulding of subjectivities by studying the intellectual interventions of EMS Namboodiripad. Research interests include intellectual histories of Global South, modern subjectivities in Kerala, gender in politics, cultural histories of left movement in India, historiography, visual anthropology and popular culture. And Chanthu has presented a paper entitled The Modern Body, Outward Marks in the Self at the 79th session of the Indian History Congress. His paper, Remolding the Private and Constructing a Public, Periyar's Response to the Gendered Public Sphere, was published in the Proceedings of Indian History Congress. And forthcoming publication is The Making of Public Man, Reminiscences from the EMS Namboodiripad, How I Became a Communist. And Chanthu is going to speak to us today on Forgotten Lives, Remembering Public, Making our Suganathan in History. Thanks, Chanthu.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the introduction. And I would like to thank the organizers for having me here and for giving the opportunity to present the paper. It's a pleasure meeting you all and to listen to intellectual histories of different contexts, especially on the interventions of Ahmed Rizal and Zhang's interpretation of different parts of China. So I have a press. Okay. The area of intellectual history in South Asia has involved two broad modes of inquiry. One is mapping the epistemic orders embedded in vernacular texts. The second is a method that looks at the epistemic sources that are reflected in the actions of the intellectuals. In the larger debate between Eurocentric perspectives and the vernacular ways of understanding the world, scholars such as Aditya Nigam have argued about the need to theorize using varied thinking cultures within and across traditions. Nigam's quest for new theorizations arises from the domination of the Western thinking traditions in colonial societies. The attempt is to enable ourselves, that is, the colonized and less capitalistic societies that we call as Global South, to theorize our own conditions adequately to ourselves. Nigam argues that there is no single Indian national intellectual or philosophical tradition from where we critically engage with the West, but only a range of diverse traditions starting from Brahminical, Buddhist, Jain, and Sufi traditions. Even though Nigam talks about possibilities of theorizing concepts in vernacular languages and traditions, it again opens up wider questions on translations, ways of thinking, and contextualizing ideas. In locating the epistemic sources that explains the actions of intellectuals, it is useful to look for varied thinking traditions. This paper studies the historiographical interventions of Puduppally Raghavan, an intellectual who experienced the transitions from the colonial to post-colonial Kerala a region in southwestern India. Through this paper, I attempt to trace the epistemic sources which influence Raghavan's intellectual interventions by studying his biography of R. Sugatan, who was a key organizer of the Coir Workers' Union in Travancore. Travancore was a princely state in the southern part of present-day Kerala. Let me give a brief summary of the life of R. Sugatan in order to contextualize Puduppalli's act of writing this biography. R. Sugatan was born as Sridharan in 1900 in lower caste Irava family in Travancore. He played a significant role in organizing the coir workers of Travancore in the 1930s and building up the Travancore Labor Association. Although coir factories had been established in the region since the 1850s, factory workers began to organize only in the 1920s. The lives of the laborers in the region of the early 20th century were characterized by multiple levels of oppression. One source of workers' oppression was the repressive policies of the Divan of Travancore. The second source of oppression was the harsh working conditions and repressive labor policies of British and local factory owners. As most of the workers belonged to lower castes, there was also an added layer of caste oppression at workplace and in larger society. The workers' movement under the banner of Travancore Labor Association set the stage for the emergence of communist mobilizations in Travancore and later towards the formation of Communist Party in Kerala. However, Sugatan's public life before his association with the Travancore Labor Association and later the organized Communist Party were multifaceted. Sugatan entered public life through participation in anti-caste movements in Travancore. One of the first initiatives of Sugatan was the founding of a youth organization aimed at opposing caste practices and superstitions in 1918 in Alappuzha. The organization also propagated the philosopher and anti-caste reformer Srinarayana Guru's messages. Sugatan later played a leading role in establishing the Alappuzha branch of radical anti-caste movement, that's Sahodara Sangam, founded by Sahodaran Ayyappan. This was a time which saw a confluence of thinking traditions in anti-caste movements in Travancore, including rationalism represented by Sahodaran Ayyappan and Vedanta, Shaivism, Siddha traditions in Narayana Guru. Sugatan also founded the Buddha mission in Alappuzha, seeking to overcome caste discrimination through conversion into Buddhism. And at this point, he changed his name from Sridharan to Sugatan. As far as Sugatan was concerned, he found a continuation of his anti-caste activities in Travancore Labor Association, which in its early phase had strong anti-caste orientations. For Sugatan, one of the few interlocutors of the undivided Communist Party in India, the struggle was against both caste and capital. As the Communist Party became established in Kerala, the task of theoretical interpretation and translation of Marxian ideology to the local context was undertaken by few intellectuals such as E.M.S. Namboodiripad. A significant aspect of this theoretical translation was the subsumption of caste into class. As Marxist commentator, E.M.S. sought to discredit the community movements of the period, which worked against the caste hierarchies in society. When upper caste intellectuals like E.M.S., who did not have any real-life experience of caste discrimination or were part of anti-caste movements, reinterpreted caste social realities, it is relevant to think about R. Sugatan's subjective positions in association with the Communist Party. We see his silence on the questions of caste in the later life of Sugatan as a political leader, parliamentarian, and orator, who speaks mainly through the newly acquired lens of class. This silence constitutes one of the entry points of this paper. Sugatan's life fades into oblivion post the split in Communist Party of India in 1964 into CPI and CPIM, and his death in 1970. It is within this silence in history that Puduppalli Raghavan serialized Sugatan's life in the 1970s in Janayugam Weekly, the mouthpiece of the Communist Party of India. It was later compiled into a book in 1979, published by Prabhat Book House, the party's publication wing. Now, let us look at the historian Puthupalli Raghavan, who marks R. Sugadan in history. Born in 1910, Puthupalli Raghavan, in his multi-volume autobiography, Vipla Smaranagal, that's Memoirs of Revolution, recalls a childhood in the background of the anti-caste mobilizations and freedom struggle. In his school days, Raghavan witnessed temple entry movements and was influenced by Gandhian ideas. Raghavan also traveled widely and met Periyar, the radical anti-caste intellectual who left a deep imprint in him. Raghavan was introduced to communism through Travancore Youth League and later played an active role in building the foundation of the Communist Party in Travancore. A proficient journalist, commentator, Raghavan's early writings pertain to peasant workers, labor movement, printing press, and local movements in southern Kerala addressing diverse audience. As a biographer, Raghavan had written biographies of national leaders such as Tilak and Gokhale. Nevertheless, R. Sugadan is the only regional figure who becomes the subject of a detailed biographical and historical treatment by Raghavan. Raghavan, in the preface of Saghav Sugadan, that's Comrade Sugadan, lays down that the book is not intended as a hagiographic chronicle of events about Sugadan. Instead, Raghavan introduces Sugadan through the contextual histories. For Raghavan, the biography is an entry point to mark the political history of Travancore in particular and Kerala in general during the phase of transition from colonial to the post-colonial Kerala. Raghavan's biography of R. Sugadan combines two modes of history writing in Kerala in the 20th century, the objective Rankian mode and the tradition of biographical and autobiographical forms of historiography. The objective scientific Rankian tradition of history writing was pioneered in Kerala by Elankulam Kunyapilla in the context of existing historiography consisting of royal, mythological, administrative, and community histories. Besides, we have to consider the role of biographies in the self-making in broader context of social reform and organized identity politics of castes such as Nayars and Egas in early 20th century. The 1970s was also a time that saw a lot of autobiographical narratives coming from the communists. Puthupalli Raghavan frames his biography of R. Sugadan in the backdrop of momentous social and political upheavals of early 20th century Travancore. For Raghavan, rather than a chronicle of events in the life of an individual, the book marks a time and place. The method of this act of writing history involves employment in objective manner of records, documents, periodicals, souvenirs, memoirs, and oral narratives. In addition to placing the text in history, Raghavan's writing the biography sought to represent voices like Sugadan, which were silenced in dominant historiographies. Firstly, it is rooted in the local milieu of Alappuzha, which were not recorded adequately in the existing histories. Alappuzha in Travancore was dominantly marked in the left historiography almost exclusively around the events of Punnapravailar uprising. This uprising refers to the protests organized by the Communist Party in Travancore against the constitutional reforms announced by C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, that's the Diwan of Travancore. The Diwan's attempt to violently suppress the revolt in Punnapura and Vailar resulted in the death of numerous protesters. Raghavan marks the micro-regional and social and political histories of Alappuzha in the early 20th century. Secondly, Raghavan's biography writing also intervened in the silences created by the preoccupations of the cultural left. The need to represent Sugadan in history was amplified by the public memory that existed in Kerala southern region in the 1970s. Significantly, it was the living memory among the non-party left public of the southern Kerala that induced Raghavan to write this history. Raghavan's writing captures the lives of people and emergence of new language of democracy in South Asia in the early 20th century. It charted a new course in regional historiography with its horizontal approach that was inclusive of the voices of people across caste and religion. Raghavan's biography locates the epistemic sources of Sugadan's life, especially the anti-caste thought traditions that shapes Sugadan's life and public interventions in the early part of later's life. This marking of Sugadan by R. Raghavan can be linked to the frames of thought shared by the author as well as the biographical subject on the idea of the social and notions of equity, which were rooted in both anti-caste frames of thought and new frames of class analysis. However, the biography does not trace the continued influence of anti-caste thought in Sugadan's life later as a communist. This reveals a narrative disjuncture on the part of Puthupalli Raghavan. This paper asks if this disjuncture is an aspect of loss in translation while marking lives in the margins. What I have attempted here is to mark the lives in the margins are marked in the existing, how the lives in the margins are marked in the existing historiographies. The idea of the social and the notions of equality available in the vernacular thinking traditions get subsumed with the new lens of analytical categories. I want to connect this disjuncture to the question of translation of new ideologies in vernacular contexts. If this is a loss in translation, and what does this entail, are some of the questions that needs to be explored further. Thank you. Okay, I'm done.
Thanks so much, Chanthu. And now we'll move to Dr. Egas de Moniz Bandeira of the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory, who's going to act as our discussant for these three papers. Thank you, Dr. Egas.
Thank you, Professor Yarrow. Thank you also, Shivatri, for organizing this wonderful conference. And thank you all three presenters for these three utterly fascinating, amazing papers, which give us all, I think, a lot of food for thought and quite thought-provoking. I'm especially glad to be here today because this panel tries to overcome that epistemological dictatorship of the area studies that we often have, right? And which leads like East Asian people to talk to East Asian people and Ottomanists to talk to Ottomanists, and it's quite difficult to enter into that conversation to form a truly global history, overcoming that. Now, I personally have connections with all three places that have been presented here today. Actually, I met Shivatri a few years ago in a conference about the global life of the Mahabharata. So I'm still writing on the paper on China-India interactions. But also my project that I am in now is about Japan, China, and the Ottoman Empire. So two of the countries that are represented here today. And that's for a reason. I'm always asking why these three. I mean, Japan and China is always something that's very easily to follow. But why the Ottoman Empire in addition to that? Well, there's a reason for that, which I think it binds two of the three papers today very closely together. And so Wen's and Banu's paper on Chanthu and Ahmed Rizal, and sets Chanthu's paper as a very interesting contrast next to them, which is that I think there is they're quite close parallels between the Chinese and the Ottoman cases. Well, all of them, the title of our panel is Peripheral Marginal Lives. And I think Chanthu's paper emphasized bringing these voices to the fore a lot. But in a sense, these voices that we're talking about here are not peripheral or marginal. They just seem so from a Eurocentric perspective. I mean, Ahmed Rizal was the first president of the Ottoman Chamber of Deputies in 1908, of the Meclisi Mibosan, pronounce it correctly. And the Zhang Taiyan, as when mentioned, was a key figure in the revolutionary movement against the Qing government. So these were quite key figures. And I think the task of global history is bringing these figures, and also an intellectual like Raghavan in India to the center, and showing their constitutive force in shaping the modern world, instead of just being on the receiving end of Western theories and ideologies. Now, I argue in my own work that the constitutional movement, which Zhang Haiyan took part in, and Ahmed Rizal took part in, were actually part of a global constitutional movement, which included a whole series of polities in Eurasia and even Africa. So we have China, we have the Ottoman Empire. In addition to that, we have Persia, we have Russia, and others, a few others, later than Siam and Ethiopia, which are 2 or 3 decades later, but still, well, all in, so these 4 or 5 large empires try to implement constitutions at more or less the same time. And Russia not, but Ottoman Empire and China have one thing in common, which is they are not really colonial objects, so that's a difference to India, but they suffer a lot of imperialist pressures, but there are some pockets, of course, we know Hong Kong and other things, but they manage to maintain their statehood in that process. Well, Zhang Haiyan argued that China was occupied by the Manchus, but they managed to not to become colonies as a whole. And in that context, intellectuals from these countries try to work out how to overcome these pressures and to modernize. And that movement is not only concomitant in the 1900s, but I would even say entangled. So when one reads scholarship on the Qing constitutionalism, and I also suspect on Persian constitutionalism as well, one always sees it painted as something that came very late and was not in conformity with the tide of the time. So in Chinese scholarship, it's 时代潮流. So it's not something that was in the tide of the times, but I would argue that's the opposite. It was actually very much in the tide of the times. It came hand in hand, and that would be an interesting question to what extent Ottoman actors also observed what was happening in China. But in China, actors observed quite eagerly what was happening in Turkey, in Persia, and so on. And they often perceived strong parallels between these two countries. I mean, the loss of the Ottoman possessions in the Balkans was something that was warning for lots of Chinese intellectuals concerned with the territorial integrity of the Qing Empire, but also the young Turk revolution was something very inspiring for Chinese intellectuals, but also officials at the same time. That's the context, I would argue, where this is happening. And another interesting parallel that I see between Zhang and Ahmed Rizal, and a bit differently perhaps in the case of Raghavan, is that they all lived abroad for a long time in a very cosmopolitan setting. Rizal, as Banu worked out, lived in Paris, which we all know was that cosmopolitan melting pot in Europe, where people from everywhere came together. But Tokyo fulfilled a very similar function in East Asia at the same time, and not only East Asia. So with the rise of Japan as a political power, it attracted lots of people, students, intellectuals from Korea, China, Mongols, people from the Philippines, Vietnam, India even. who formed Pan-Asia networks, Pan-Asianist networks at that time, and developed their ideas in this dialogue. And that's something that Zhang also partook in. I would be interested also in how that move to Tokyo maybe influenced his thought in that regard. I know that Zhang for a while was very interested in studying Sanskrit. He formed a study group and hired an Indian Sanskrit teacher. That didn't work out because the Sanskrit teacher, they couldn't communicate very well, but so they tried to communicate with each other. And that I'm interested also in how Zhang, as you talked about, shared identities, how he reconciled Confucianism with Taoism, Buddhism, Brahmanism, other East Asian traditions in his thought. As a side note, you said book written in oppression. I've seen it somewhere in literature as book of urgency. That's just a very niche question, but is there, what was the rationale for interpreting the title of his book? So is that written in oppression, China being oppressed by the Manchus, or is it an urgency to change things? Yeah, so similarly for Rizal in the same time, how did he explain that comparatively weak position of the Ottoman Empire? We've heard that for Zhang it was that certain tradition that of empty learning that he credited with China's decline. So yeah, how did Rizal see that, and also Raghavan for interpret that part of Indian history, which is, as I see, is a question that was very prevalent among intellectuals in China, but also in other places. And also, as Zhang was a Pan-Asianist, I found it very interesting also that Rizal was very successful in getting his message across the Atlantic, and positivism was a huge thing in Brazil. So you talked about order in progress, these things. If you see the Brazilian flag today, it's written order in progress, which is not what Brazil is like, but it's there. So this connection is very interesting. But on the other hand, universalism, and you mentioned that Rizal also talks about Oriental, Oriental things. So how exactly did he define it? What included Oriental for Rizal, and did he have also such Pan-Asianist inclinations? Yeah. So to conclude, I think when counters that assumption that the collapse of the imperial state has deprived the Confucian tradition of its only foundation, which is a very keen and interesting observation. So I wonder whether we couldn't say the opposite, and not only for China, but for a lot of other settings, which would be interesting to compare and weigh that in. And I don't know whether you agree, but just putting that, if it's not the opposite of that, namely that maybe not the collapse, but the decline of traditional modes of legitimation necessitated new modes in form of written laws and ultimately constitution, which in turn many intellectuals had to think about ways to transpose their old epistemologies and their vernacular traditions into this new framework. So I think that's not so different from what happened in Europe, actually, where also we have the decline of ecclesiastical authority, which correlated with the desire for rational lawgiving and legitimation, not through divine grace, but through modern written norms. And that's where in China too, when the Confucian classics come under some attack, there is a space for constitutionalism to enter. But then Kang Youwei and his new learning, but also Zhang Taiyan and his intellectual strand, tried to save Confucianism for this new framework. We have the declaration of the Qing government, January 1901, distinguishing form and substance, where the substance has to stay Chinese, but it's then officially established that the form is very malleable, adaptable to modernity. And that's what Hawkling Yan also argued, actually. And he refers expressly to Kang Youwei's tradition. And he was a Chinese student who wrote his PhD in Cornell in 1911. So half a year before the collapse of the Qing Empire. He wrote that, and I quote, that the classics, in spite of their defectiveness and the various traditions the alterations that have been made by sycophantic courtier scholars to ingratiate themselves with the emperor, a careful student can always discern the main lines of thought contained therein. Indeed, with the progress of time, and especially the advent of Western civilization, their holds on the minds of the people has been shaken, their venerableness derided, and they have been again and again charged with responsibility for the present degeneration and decay of China. However, the best scholarship of the country inclines to believe that the classics will survive this rude treatment, and in time, after having discarded their dilapidated garment, will come out triumphant. And that's maybe a thought that also appeared in India and the Ottoman Empire, I would suppose, and ask for confirmation. Also, in the case in the colonial case of India, I would also be interested in what exactly were these vernacular traditions that Raghavan, but also Sugatan drew from. And I think you mentioned dharma at some point, and how exactly they operationalized this Buddhist concept of dharma for these this intellectual enterprise. Well, yeah. So that's, I think, I'm also reaching my time limit. So I'll thank you again, and yeah, look forward to the discussion and further questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Egas, for bringing those papers together and putting them into a wider framework and context for us to use as the basis of a conversation. Shivatri, are we moving to questions now? Is that our next? Have we time for that?
Yeah, there is. We still have 5-7 minutes for that. But the thing is, we don't have any questions from the audience. So I have some thoughts on some of the presentations, and I would like to take my privilege as the host to sort of ask a few questions, and then maybe we can have responses on Egas's comments from the panelists. So my comment or my thought in general would be to sort of tie the presentations together. Is that when we use biographical methods to write intellectual histories, and more specifically global intellectual histories, what are the methodological stakes of that process? Do we use ideas as entry points, or do we put individuals in their particular context, and then how do we abstract from that? So like, these are the individuals you talked about in your presentations are people rooted in very particular spatiotemporal contexts, right? And so from that, how do we move, not essentially upwards, because I don't want to make a binary between, local and global, but things like that, but essentially how to sort of bring these multiple spatialities and temporalities, weave them together through these abstractions that these people were writing about, essentially, if that makes sense. And yeah, would love to hear responses and thoughts on that. Go ahead. We'll go in the order of presentations. Then we can start with Wen.
So to first respond to Shratri's question, and then I think what my experience is that in some way methodologically, I'm really a Cambridge school follower. So in a sense that I do really believe in contextualization, especially if we take individuals as historical actors. So that's my first step. So regardless the local context or larger conceptual context, I think restoring the claims of the person in context is the first step. And that actually can bring people to see like from individual level and to see what kind of issues they're responding or what kind of type of intellectual they belong to, because there are patterns like across different traditions. There are people who are more into universalistic thought. There are people who are more interested in philologists. So there are patterns we see re-emerge from different cultural traditions that they have certain interests. So that actually brings the possibility of comparing what type of men or what type of thinkers and what kind of question they address and what kind of text they use. So I think like certainly for me, the first step will be a contextualization of individual actions and articulations. And then, but that of course involves really a comparative or deep knowledge of the local context and local textual traditions. Do other two panelists want to address this question, or should I move on to addressing Egas' question and then I will finish and then I leave it to others? So what do you want to do?
Yeah, one common thread that I found between both presentations was how intellectuals work as intermediaries or as interlocutors between the past and the present, especially in the case of Ahmed Rizal and Zhang's interpretation of the past. And another aspect is I found that both Rizal and Zhang were working towards a sort of uniformity, which allows us to think more on the disciplining of a sort of disciplining of the self. So how did this uniformity work in both Rizal's ways of addressing things, and then what is it for Zhang's interventions or his interpretations of China's different pasts? And with regard to the biography as a mode of reading history, I mean, can you repeat the question? What you asked, as in like?
Yeah, so and this specifically ties up with your presentation, because I think your actors were dealing with something as universal as the communist or Marxist ideology. So the thing that I was wondering about is that using biography as a tool for writing intellectual history, certain things comes at stake, right? Like, do we prioritize, do we use ideas as the entry point, or do we use individuals and their particular context in which they're writing as the entry point? That was basically, yeah.
In this particular context, I was looking at the silences in history and the act of writing history, which is political for argument. That is the entry point that I was looking at in this particular paper.
Right. Just to come in quickly, we have one question from the audience. I'll just read it out loud so that people can respond. This is a question for all panelists built on so this is a comment on my question on biography. Swati Birla writes, I'm curious, when does biography as a mode of recording experience arise in your context, and how does it relate to other registers of history writing? So what are the implications for recovering experiences that are usually lost in subalternity or subaltern experiences?
That is precisely where oral traditions and then how it is recovered through the writing comes in. I think there is a particular book by Vijay Ramaswamy, who is edited in Biography as History. You can look more on it. And Uday Kumar also has written on autobiographies and biographies as history.
Is that someone's background? Yeah. Banu, would you like to respond to some of the? Yeah.
So I thought it was my turn. So like to your first question, so I mean, I also got embedded in the Cambridge school. I having spent more than a decade, so it was almost inevitable. And also supervised by one of the founders of this Cambridge school. So I mean, I'm quite close to this method. And so which means we contextualize the ideas within, or situate the ideas within their context. And also what's important is like to which tradition or to which tradition a thinker belongs to. I think that's also quite important. But one thing that I also discovered is like, you know, most thinkers use same ideas like liberty, in progress, constitutionalism, but the meaning they attach to these concepts varies. So that's what's important is to kind of not only like textualize them or not just looking at the text, but also show the interrelation or intertextuality, which is really, really important. So which means we can't just really like interpret a text by looking at certain text, but actually like reading the whole text and books and like to try to see what a certain thinker means by a particular term and how he was engaged with other thinkers, how his meaning or the definition he used concept changed over time, because it's also what happens in the writings of these thinkers. And also like how it's so important to see like how these thinkers are engaged with Western or non-Western thinkers, because one of the problems is usually like when we deal with these extra-European thinkers, it's assumed that they're only like dealing with their own issues with the national context, but especially Ahmed Rizal is, I mean, he was dealing with the French thinkers, writing, and also dealing with British positivists, engaged with Latin American positivists. He's trying to respond to Ottoman positivists, Ottoman public opinion. So to me, that's why it's really, really important. Like not all thinkers do that and not all of them are engaged with it. But it's really important to see like how their ideas shaped political action. Because otherwise we treat ideas as abstract entities, but it's important to see how ideas shape politics or sometimes how politics shape ideas. So these are the things that I'm interested in. And the comments were excellent. So if I have a minute to respond to Egas comments, they're
Briefly,
really
yes.
interesting. Yeah, it's really great, really thought-provoking. And to your first question, like how Ottomans, I mean, responded to the changes in China. I mean, I was also like thinking about it just right before, before the conference. And I actually forgot to say that I'm translating Ahmed Rizal's all writings from Ottoman into English and also his French writings into English. And I'm planning to publish them as a book because, I mean, not all of them are accessible to a wider audience. So that was my concern. And it really also helped me to kind of understand this, the political goal or intellectual goal of Ahmed Rizal. And in one of the articles, he was, especially Khalil Ghanem, who was a collaborator of Ahmed Rizal, he was responding to the Boxer Revolution or Boxer events. It's really interesting because, I mean, the good thing about this Zoom event is that I can just go back to my notes and then actually find a quotation, which I would really like to read just one sentence. It says, "This defeat is a consequence of a jealous and egoistic politics. The powers only seek one thing in the Orient as well as in the Far East. It is to create troubles there as to extend the commercial interest for a while material profit." And then he says, like, why don't we just trade? Why don't we have peaceful relations rather than creating hostility and jealousy? So like they were also engaged with other questions, not only with the Eastern question, but also with the Far Eastern question, with the Indian question. So they were not, like I said, not only engaged with the national questions. And how Ahmed Rizal saw the weakness of the Ottoman Empire. He thinks the main cause is despotism. So he says this despotism weakened the ties, weakened the social ties, weakened the political ties, and it makes it vulnerable to Western intervention. And I saw a similar comment in Van's article. Like for that reason, Ottoman constitutionalists, they attached importance to the idea of representative government. And they believe that representative government is a motor of progress. And political strength. So when the way they understand power is basically political power, unity, and order. So once the positivist despotism is replaced by representative government and constitutional regime, that is going to repair the weakened ties and will make Ottoman Empire stronger. So I can talk more about it, but the main cause is really the political weakness, and it comes from misrule.
Yeah, hi. We're already 5 minutes over time, so I'm going to wrap this up now. It has been very fascinating to hear these papers from Wayne, Chanthu, and Banu. Thank you so much. Egas, lovely, fascinating comments. And Dr. Yarrow, thank you so much for sharing. And I hope all of you will join us for some of the remaining sessions of the day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.